I'll start with a personal note. I was an MA, I'm an MA in English literature, and I was teaching English literature. Now I happened to go to a place which was called at that time Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages. Now it is IFLU. It's in Hyderabad, where I did a kind of diploma course in teaching of English. In the first semester, there were some 3 courses that I was doing related to language studies. In particular, there was a course on Introduction to Linguistics, a course on grammar, and a course on phonology and phonetics. So I was doing these courses, and I found, let me share this with you. I found the entire subject of linguistics absolutely banal. There was nothing of, in phonology and phonetics, there was hardly anything that was of any interest to me. And grammar, I didn't particularly care for grammar. And during those days, there was a negative attitude towards grammar and all that. So grammar was considered to be something fit enough to be taught at school and not at higher levels. So I carried that, prejudice with me. So at that time, I thought, it's okay, I don't really, I'm not bothered about this. When it came to linguistics, we were taught things like the difference between human language and animal systems of communication. It was a very traditional kind of topic in the courses of, in introductory courses during those days. And that is one topic I found extremely silly. I'm not bothered about how animals communicate. I'm going to go and I'll go and teach English to human beings, and I'm not bothered. Why waste my time? And then questions like phonological structure, morphological structure, etc., etc. I thought, okay, these may excite some people, but there was absolutely nothing that heightened my or that made me interested in these subjects. The course was ending, and the last 3 or 4 classes were there. And my teacher, all the teachers are excellent, but the subjects were uninteresting. And the last few classes, the 3 classes were devoted to a topic called transformational grammar. And I remember in the first lecture, the course instructor said that there is a person called Noam Chomsky, and he says that all languages are identical at the level of some underlying representation, at the level of, so they share common structural features. Now, I'm not exaggerating, I'm telling you, I woke up. I thought, what kind of a thing is this? We know that languages are, I was in Hyderabad, so Telugu was unintelligible to me. The fact of language unintelligibility is, was nothing new. And we know that 2 languages which are mutually unintelligible it may not be the case that they have entirely different structures. That we knew. We had that much understanding of abstraction. We knew that structurally, let us say, Tamil and Odia, that's my language, So they are unintelligible, mutually unintelligible, but they share a structure. So we knew that that's fine. But then languages which cannot be linked in terms of history, genealogy, nothing, absolutely unrelated languages. Okay, and then here is a person who is saying that they have an identical structure at some underlying level. I thought this is something which is marvelous. And he is saying something which sounds patently absurd. And so many people take him seriously. So I think I was in my early 30s then. Now till I retired from IIT Kanpur, those 30 years I devoted to finding out what is all this about. Okay, and I don't regret a moment of it. So fascinating. I mean, see, we know that if you say languages are different, and languages have a different structure, each language has its own unique structure. Fine. I mean, that doesn't disturb anybody, because one would think that, okay, that's experience. English has a subject, verb, object kind of structure. My language has subject, object and verb kind of structure. So there are, in many ways, languages could differ like this at the level of structure. So that's not surprising. Okay, but what is surprising is the fact that there is a kind of common sharing in terms of structures. So what is that? So I forgot my PhD research on E.M. Foster and thought that, okay, let me see what this is all about. I mean, it's almost like, sort of going on a discovery trip, sort of finding out what all this is about. It's a kind of, powerful intellectual experience. Many people would have joined, would have tried to do linguistics for the same reason. How come? Sort of, how does one account for the fact that languages share, that's the claim, common features at some underlying level, and yet, they demonstrate different structural properties at other levels. Okay. So that's something which, that is, what is, how does one articulate the underlying similarities between languages and their systematic differences? Languages do not differ from each other in structural terms in absolutely unpredictable, ways. The ways languages differ from each other in structural terms are predictable, right? So we know that that two languages can differ along certain lines. They cannot differ arbitrarily. Okay, it cannot be the case that there would be a language in which take a sentence of, take a sentence of a considerable length, right, and create a sentence which is the mirror image of that sentence, and think that if the first sentence is grammatical, the mirror image of that sentence is also grammatical. Nothing of this kind. So there cannot be languages like this. So this is very fascinating that languages differ, surely, but they differ in predictable ways, in limited ways. So, what kind of a theory is there to be able to account for all this? So that's where, sort of, I think many people, I mean, I was a small fry, but many people would have been interested in trying to find out what is this all about. So that's one. And when Chomsky came into the scene, the kind of grammar that was written was what was called, descriptive grammar, structural, grammar. There was a school of linguistic thought called structural linguists. So they were very hardworking people. They did a lot of creative things in their own domain. But then, when they said that, you see, linguistics is a science. They were the first people who said that linguistics is a science and a classificatory science. It's a classificatory science. So what did it mean? It meant something like this, that let us say, talking about sentences. So let us say we divide all sentences of the language into various, subparts, various groups. So call a particular kind of category, various categories, call a category simple sentences, another category, simple negatives, another category, sort of simple questions, then compound questions. So categorize sentences and label each category. So simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. Within simple, negatives, questions, imperatives, whatever. So you collect data very carefully using the most sophisticated instruments of data collection and arrives at sentence level. You do a lot more. You start from the phonological level and then you come to the sentence level. And then when you come to the sentence level, what you do is you categorize your sentences in terms of subcategories like simple, compound, complex, just as I told. Okay. Now, see, categorization is not a simple task. It's a fairly challenging intellectual task, because you are looking at the features and carefully trying to say which are the distinctive or distinguishing features of each category. So, it is not a small thing, we should not really think that it is unimportant. But when I was teaching at IIT Kanpur, I used to say that this is like what happens in a Bata Dukan. You go to a Bata shoe shop and you have 5 number shoes, 7 number shoes, 8 number shoes in different in different sort of slots. Okay. Now, of what great interest is this? I mean, we trivialized it, but now I don't want to trivialize. The categorization is a serious task. I mean, you find out features, common features, distinguishing features. So it's not unimportant. But you see, when it comes at the end of it, what have you done? At the end of it, you simply have sort of slotted them into different categories, and that's about it. Now, Chomsky said, no, this cannot be a very interesting and serious science. It can't be interesting. And science is not concerned about classification. Although much later I came to learn that today biology is a very sophisticated subject, but only 50 years ago biology was a classificatory science. I mean, about 50 years ago. Okay, it was more or less a classificatory science. Okay, so maybe disciplines have to undergo a stage of classification. Maybe questions of explanatory nature. Maybe it's difficult that such questions are asked at a certain level of an intellectual enterprise. So maybe a kind of stage has to be gone through where classification becomes extremely important. But then Chomsky said, no, we need explanatory theories. Okay, so what kind of explanatory theories do we need? What do we explain? Okay. So, for the first time, I mean, he not only, he said, what kind of a science linguistics would be? What kind of a science is this? At that time, today it's slightly different, but at that time, there are no experiments. You couldn't conduct experiments, okay, right? You come up with, you postulate linguistic rules, but there are no experimental, there are no experimental evidence for the same, right? So, some people, who wrongly associate science with explanation, associate science with experimentation. Mature sciences like physics and all, we know that. I mean, sort of, how important experimentation is there for those sciences. So, because of the success of the natural sciences, so sometimes, people tend to associate experimentation with scientific inquiry. So, if your science or what you are claiming to be science has no experiments, right, your science cannot be taken seriously. It is at best a kind of, folklore, or it's at best a kind of, pre-scientific science or whatever, if you call it a science, okay, right. So, don't make any scientific claims for that, so you don't have an experiment. So, how does one get support, for the postulations that you are making? Okay, so that was there. But then that's not a very serious, see, for example, in astronomy, okay, what kind of experimentation do you have in astronomy? And is astronomy art? I wish it were, but is it art? It's not. So, it is not the case that in all sciences, you would like to have experimentation. Now, if you don't have experimentation in your, in your domain of inquiry, which you want to call science, okay, how does one evaluate the findings, right? How does one evaluate the findings? Whatever findings you have arrived at, how does one check? Now, if there is no way to check whether your findings are correct or incorrect or whatever, right, then we are not doing any, we are not into any rational enterprise. We are into some kind of mystic enterprise. Okay, you say something, and by definition or definitionally that's true. It's almost making a claim like that. So what? So what does one do? So all right. So you write a grammar of English. Let's imagine you write a grammar of English. Okay. Now, so what do you do? How do you test it? Okay. The simplest thing is, so long as you are writing a grammar of English, you test it against the data. So does it account for all data? Okay. Does it account for, in this case, would mean does it cover all data? Right. So if it covers all data, you think that okay, maybe there is, it's right. Okay. But soon you know that you are not, an enterprise cannot stop with writing the grammar of or working out the grammar of a single language, because English is a language, so is Hindi, so is Odia, so is Swahili, so are many other languages, right? They are all objects of the same type. They are all objects of the same type, right? So a kind of descriptive mechanism or a descriptive device that you have arrived at for one language, right, should apply to other languages as well, because there is no science where for each object of inquiry there is a kind of theory. So it cannot be the case that for Hindi there will be a theory of grammar, for English there will be a theory of grammar, and these theories of grammar will have there will be no way to converse. I mean, no conversation would be possible between these theories of grammar. That's a false thing. It was noted way back in 57. It was noted that all grammars of languages, people wrote grammars of various languages. Now, you had notions like subject, you had notions like object, you had notions like noun, verb, pronoun, like that, verb, right? So, is it accidental that when somebody writes a grammar of English, he uses these terms? You write a grammar of Sanskrit, you also use these terms, right? So, is it accidental that languages, when you write grammars of different languages, the grammatical vocabulary is something which is largely similar? How does it happen? Okay, huh? So, the question that arises is, where do you get your basic terms from? Okay, right? Where do you get the terms from? So, these have to come from some kind of a theory. There has to be a theory of grammar, and from that theory of grammar would itself specify that these are the kinds of notions that we are going to have, and these are the kind of interactions that we are going to have between whatever entities. So, what are the entities? How do the entities sort of interact? So, these are things which cannot be just for one language, they have to be for all languages. Okay, it's not an accident that you have as I said, it's not an accident that subject, object, verb, noun, pronoun, etc. categories, category labels. Whenever you write a grammar for any language, these are the categories which you use. How come? Okay, huh? So, if you have to find an explanation for this, you cannot find an explanation from history of writing of grammars. No, you can't say, oh, let's write a history of grammars of all languages, and somewhere you won't get it anywhere. You have to have something like a linguistic theory, a grammatical theory, and the theory will give us the terminology, the basic concepts, the interactions, everything, right? So, for the first time in the history of linguistics, there was felt the need for a theory of language or theory of grammar. See, linguistics is not, linguistics was not always called linguistics. It was called grammar or whatever else, okay? But linguistics is a civilizational subject. It is not something which is recent. 2,500 years ago, in Greek civilization, linguistics was being done. And even earlier in India, people were doing linguistics. We talk about Panini, who is probably 2,500 years old, but Panini is only the finest flowering of a tradition that existed. Panini, it's not that grammatical tradition started with Panini, no. Lots of people had worked before Panini worked. So, these rich traditions, so grammatical studies are that old, okay. But for the first time in the history of grammatical studies, the need for a general grammatical theory, general linguistic theory was felt. I am not saying that people who wrote grammars before did not have a theory of grammar. They had a theory of grammar, but what that theory of grammar was, it was never explicated, because it was not necessary to spell out the kind of grammar that they had, okay, kind of theory of grammar that they had. In other words, what is the theory of grammar? What are the goals of study of grammar, right? What does it explain something? Does it categorize something? What does it do? Okay, what are the upper boundaries and lower boundaries? The usual question that you ask about theories, right? Right? So, and what is the architecture? They had some notion. Surely, if you don't have these theoretical notions, you cannot write a grammar, right? The person who wrote a grammar of, Sanskrit phonology, morphology, etc., or Karaka, had an idea of what a grammatical system is like what a language is like, what kind of structural system the language is likely to have. That is why he divided them into phonology, morphology, whatever he had. But then there was no articulation of it, there is no explicit articulation of it. So the need for an explicit articulation of the theory of grammar was felt so strongly and was realized, and this is when Chomsky came into the scene. So we must remember Chomsky as a man, right, who for the first time articulated the need for an explicit linguistic or grammatical theory. Okay, and then the other so you have a theory and all these will follow. The grammatical terminology will follow, and terminology is just one part of it, because you are talking about what are terms? The terms are labels of entities, and next is interaction between entities, and they interact within a framework, and that's the architecture. So all these things would come, okay, at later stage, right? All these things would come, okay, and then you write your grammar in terms of that, right? Now, suppose you have postulated something, right, in your model, and you are saying that this is something which is a general feature of all languages. Imagine something like, what I am going to say, okay, imagine something like you have done phrase structure rules, right? You are familiar with phrase structure rules, okay. Imagine that phrase structure rules are part of universal grammar, a term with which you are familiar, right? Let us imagine that phrase structure rules are a part of universal grammar. Now, how do you know, coming back to the question as to if we don't have experiments, right, how do we test our findings, our hypothesis, okay, right? So how do we test? So we test it like this: if you can arrive at a grammar where you can dispense with phrase structure rules completely, right, that you would say that is something, that's a test. So when you can postulate a theory of grammatical universals, right, but then this theory of grammatical universals, whether a particular rule or a particular mechanism or a particular whatever, right, kind of rule, etc. So if this rule has to stand the test of scrutiny, from other languages, right? So you write a grammar of another. Let's say there is let's say you are postulating some rule on the basis of English. Let us say that you can do. You can say that we have phrase structure rules in English grammar, and our hypothesis is that phrase structure rules do not simply belong to the grammar of English. Phrase structure rules belong to they are a part of universal grammar. Now, if somebody works if somebody is working on some other language and is able to argue that you don't have a need for the phrase structure rules that you have postulated, and you are claiming universality of universal status for them, right? Then the phrase structure rules sort of they are questioned. They cannot be. So the test, so the testing device comes from careful analysis of another language, of the grammatical features of another grammatical systems of another language. Okay. So please notice one thing. You can't. Data cannot falsify a theoretical claim, right? Suppose you are making a theoretical claim about whether about the fact that phrase structure rules exist as part of universal grammar, right? They are a part of universal grammar. Okay. So let's imagine that this is a theoretical claim that you are making. At the moment, it is an assumption. You have posited it on the basis of study of a single language, a careful study of a single language. Okay, right? The testing comes not from the fact that there are sentences in other languages, right, which seem to falsify the claim. So data cannot falsify the theoretical claim, right? Data cannot. Direct, unanalyzed, raw data cannot falsify a theoretical claim. Okay. What can is analyze data into a system of rules. A rule, if there is a rule that exists, or you are claiming a rule to be universal, a counterexample will be from from another grammar in terms of another rule. Rules, that kind of thing. You cannot you cannot falsify, direct unanalyzed data cannot be used to falsify, or question or undervalue, theoretical postulations. In this particular case, as something like a theory of rule. Okay, so you know what move alpha. Okay, right? Know what move alpha. Okay. If you find an example from another language which says that we really don't need something like move alpha. Okay, we can do whatever move alpha does, we can do by using some other device, and we can do something more. And if, so look at the level of claim. The claim is being made at the level of a rule, not at the level of, direct raw data, okay, right? So what Chomsky did was, it's interesting, what he did was, he not only created a sort of field in the sense he raised new questions with respect to grammar, he also provided a way of how to test them, because experimental testing at that time was not there, okay. Okay. Now, today there are experiments, people do conduct experiments, right? But, I am not going to get into that, and there are all kinds of questions that can be raised with respect to those experiments as if you want to use them to falsify theories, there are complications there, they are not straightforward. So, let us not go into that, okay. So, all that so far what I have tried to suggest is this, that linguistics was considered to be a classificatory science when Chomsky came into the scene. Chomsky said classificatory science is okay, but not sufficient. A discipline has to be, it has to be explanatory in nature. So you have to come up with explanations. Now, what kind of explanation? What is it that you are explaining? Okay, the data are what you are explaining, right? And what is explanation? You come up with more and more, simpler, more elegant grammars. So the grammar itself is a kind of explanation, for the data. So, it's explained by grammar, okay, and the falsification of this or testing of this will come from grammars of other languages, right? Okay. So something like that, so roughly so this is what it is. And many interesting questions started getting raised. Say for example, consider something like subject, object and verb, right? Take them as 3 different categories. So how many combinations are possible? 8 combinations, I think, no? You can permute them and combine them in 8 ways, right? So, so what would we expect? We would expect that we will encounter languages in the world, right, which will demonstrate each one of these categories, right? So there will be languages which demonstrate each of these categories. But the fact is that it's not really like this. Most of the languages are SOV, Hindi type SOV languages. Quite a large number of languages are English type, SVO. Some are VSO, okay, and maybe there are certain other types, okay, and I am forgetting details, but there are certain categories which do not show up at all, okay. So that's the kind of thing. So you see, if you have a certain kind of, if you have this VSO, right, I'm sorry, if you take these terms, subject, verb and object, right, okay, and think in terms and sort of think of languages, right. So you will expect something like 8 categories, and you will expect the world to demonstrate these categories, but that doesn't happen. So what we are dealing with here is not a question of logic, but something else. Logically, you would expect all these sort of categories of languages to be there in the world, but they are not there. So what we are dealing with is not really a question of logic, but something else. Okay. Now, why is it that most of the languages are of SOV and SVO types, and there are language types which are not simply there? Why is the world like this? So there is a variety, linguistic world, there is a variety. It's not it's not uniform in the sense that there is not just one type of language SOV. No, there is a variety. Okay, but the variety is a constrained kind. It is not that whatever is sort of whatever all the logical possibilities are realized in actual in actual reality of languages. It's not like that. Okay, so this is a question to ask. Why is it like this? Now look at the kind of question that is being asked. Okay, right? These were never the kind of questions which were asked before Chomsky came into the scene. Right? In the 60s and all these questions, or early 70s, these questions were getting asked, and these questions, in all those thousands of years of our rich linguistic history, no one ever asked these questions. The reasons are of course simple. I mean, you always looked at one language. So you wrote the most economical grammar of one language, right? You never thought that, okay, here is another language, right? Okay, So what I am saying for this language, and if I find that there are similarities, I find in other languages which I am exposed to in day-to-day life, okay, it never, it never attracted the attention of any one of them to find out, is this similarity accidental? Okay. It is not that, sort of in our, Panini or our great Sanskrit grammarians did not know any other language or were not exposed to any other language. So they were, But you see, there were certain attitudes because of which they never cared to study them. If you look up, the tradition, sort of Bimal Matilal says that our Sanskrit scholars, grammarians, would study the language of somebody, of a category of people whom he called Shistas. Shista. Shista is one who is not just a scholar, but also a man with, spiritual attainments. See, so if you say that we are going to study the language of a set of people, okay, and this will be kind of, elite, okay, and we will not bother about the study of any other, sort of groups of people, right? What would you do? This is one of the consequences, that even though you find that, the people whom you have defeated in some war and taken them as slaves to your households, okay, they speak a different language, you will not treat their language seriously, consider their language seriously, because you don't treat them seriously. And you have decided that you would study the language of only, in some sense, the purest kind of language, okay. All these terms make no sense in a democratic world, okay, right. But, if you decide to study that, that's true everywhere. In the Western tradition, look at the grammar books. The best of writings of the best of authors were what? Were the data for grammatical analysis. Spoken language are hardly analyzed, debased, corrupt. Anyway, sort of. So you see, because I think, you see, it's very difficult to find a social, you see, if you are writing, you're looking at the history of knowledge, it is very difficult to explain certain things in that history in terms of sociological facts. I'm not saying that this would explain that, but perhaps, if we did not, you see, all these things, if we did not in our civilization consider the fact that if Sanskrit has a structure like this, some other language has also similar structures. Even when you notice, you didn't raise any question out of it, right? And that's because we were possibly, sort of, we didn't think that languages of others was considered to be a serious subject of investigation. And sister, so long as the sister attitude is there, we will study the language of the sisters alone. And sister, is defined not as somebody who is a scholar, but also as somebody who has spiritual attainments, who is studying for the sake of the study, who is studying for, not for any benefit, but for general good, things of this kind. So if you do that, your data domain is shrunk, okay. So other similarities and dissimilarities, you just ignore, right? It is only when you discover, it is only when you note the similarities and dissimilarities that your mind gets challenged to find out how come, how come there is a similarity and how come there are dissimilarities. So you will try and explain this in terms of, in some term, okay. One is, postulate something called a universal grammar and postulate parameters, which will define, the systematic differences between grammars, okay, huh? So, only when you notice this, and only when you think that this is something that is worthy enough for investigation, okay, huh? The languages, some features are similar, some features are dissimilar. How does one explain dissimilarity and similarity, right? How does one explain dissimilarity and similarity, right? So you can do it in many ways. You can do it. Let's try and see what we can do with this simple observation, that let's say given 2 languages or 3 languages, we find certain similarities between them at the structural level, right? And we find certain dissimilarities. How do we go about it? So suppose we say, the fundamental principle, all languages differ, right, structurally, right? Suppose we say all languages differ structurally, right? Period. You can't raise the question about similarity. If languages differ from each other, and if that is the story, right? Okay, that is what your observation is, that languages differ from each other, right? So suppose you say we have a theory and we look at the grammars like this. All languages are, each language is unique and is describable in its own terms. Suppose you have this kind of a theory, okay, right? The question of accounting for similarities cannot even be raised, right? Now suppose you have an alternative theory and says all languages, there is a lot of, you finding similarities, you say all languages are similar. And suppose you say this, it is false. It just cannot be, right? So then, but if you take that kind of a view, you at least have a possibility of trying to find out, okay, given the similarities, how do I account for the differences? Okay, and when you discover the differences are not, sort of wild and unpredictable, right? Arbitrary, then you will have a way of trying to find out how to, sort of account for this similarity and dissimilarity, right? Okay, so that's the universal grammar. And that's parameters, okay, right? Parameters where, sort of in one model they are called, the term parameter is used for them in one model. Earlier the term was not used, something else was used, but essentially the fact is that how do we account for the similarities between, grammars of different languages and their systematic dissimilarities. So you are working out in various models at various times in many ways, okay, So this is something, okay. Now let's go to something else. See, in all cultures, another 2 o'clock, no? Yes. Yeah, in our culture, and I am sure in other cultures as well, at least in our culture. See, look at you had people like, we had a rich grammatical tradition, Panini and all, right? So you ask them this question, okay, how is, what is the, what is the grammar of Sanskrit, right? One extremely good answer is Panini's grammar. An economical, detailed, economical, sophisticated, formal, generative grammar. Panini is the first generative linguist and not Chomsky, because you look at Panini's phonological rules, they are generative rules. Okay. So in any case, that's another topic. In any case, so a very sophisticated grammar, right? So what is the structure of Sanskrit? Panini's grammar is the answer. What is the structure of Sanskrit? Panini's grammar is the answer. How is Sanskrit learned? Or how is Sanskrit learned? In Ashtadhyayi, you will have no insights about how this is all learned. Okay, right? So those who really worked out the structures did not address themselves to the question of how these structures are acquired by people or learned by people. No, right? Similarly, at a later stage, there are thinkers in our culture who raise this question: how do children learn a language? Okay. So, and they came up with answers, like, through observation. They find that somebody is telling somebody, bring the horse. So actually somebody goes and brings the horse, okay, right? And somebody says, pass the salt. So, they listen to the sentences through observation, they make inferences and all that. So, they learn from experience, they learn from explicit teaching, they learn from the grammar books, they learn from, lexicon, the dictionary, so many ways, right? Okay. Now, what they said would resemble very much what our behaviorists said about learning. The behaviorists, positivists, what they said about how things are learned. Essentially, things are learned from experience. Okay, So nothing like, mind is a clean slate. I'm oversimplifying everything really. Okay, so the mind is a clean slate, so there's nothing in it. So from experience we keep on, we abstract from experience and keep on adding knowledge, right? So that is how it is learned. So somebody says, bring the horse or whatever, okay, right? Bring the horse or bring the food, and you find that this is happening. So from this, the child infers the grammar, and it is supplemented by classroom teaching, grammar books, blah, 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 all these kinds of things. Okay. So essentially, this is a kind of behaviorist account. Essentially, it's a behaviorist account of, language learning. Okay. Right. And these people who were concerned with the question of how a language is learned, okay, did not ask themselves the question, what is the structure of a language? So the point that I am trying to make is that, you see, what is the structure of language was a question which was independent of the question, how is that language is learned, or how are those structures learned. So the structure of a language and the learning of a language were two distinct questions. Okay, and they were answered in different ways, right? Now, what Chomsky did was, in some sense, he combined these, and that's a great achievement. Okay, so he said, questions like this. Okay, how do you compare? In the beginning, right, when he came up with this, generative grammar, transformational generative grammar, and there are the structural grammars before that. Structural grammars, traditional grammars. Before that, all those grammars existed. So the question will arise: how do you compare these grammars? Okay, so you can say sort of. Generative grammars try to show sentence relationships. That what's the relation between active and passive? What's the relation between an imperative and a non-imperative? Like what is the relation between sentences, right? So you apply a passive transformation or whatever, and you get a passive sentence. Imagine that. Let's imagine this. Okay. So you have an active structure, apply a passive transformation, so you get a passive sentence. Okay. Just one thing, so transformations are not applied to sentences. They are applied to structures. Okay. In any case, so you are trying to find relationships, right? Okay. That is coming is a fact. It is a fact that is coming. So you relate these sentences. Okay. Right. So let's say generative grammar was trying to find sentence relationships and account for sentence relationships. What does that mean, explain or account for? In terms of the grammatical system. The system would say that, okay, we can generate these sentences and all that, right? Okay. Now, structural linguists would say, no, we never tried this. We didn't try this. So why are you comparing us with generative linguists and say that we are inferior in some sense? Okay. Because, we never tried this. You have changed the goalposts. So, right? Okay. So you can't change the goalpost and score goals over us, because we never, what we never did. Then how do you compare grammars then? Now, the answer that was given at that time was, that grammar is the best, or that grammar is the most appropriate, the most suitable grammar, which explains language acquisition facts better, right? So look at the connection now. So sort of there is a structural grammar and there is a generative grammar. Generative grammar is trying to account for sentence differences, sentence relatedness, which structural linguistics did not try to do. So the question is, these are incommensurable. The goals are incommensurable. We are trying to do X, they are trying to do Y, and you can't compare these two models of grammar, because their objectives are different. How can you do that? Okay. Then the answer to this is, yeah, you still can compare them on a different parameter, and that parameter has nothing to do with grammar. That parameter has to do with how, which explains language acquisition facts better, right? Look at the assumptions you are making now. The assumption you are making is, if an architecture of structure, right, can be evaluated in terms of how it is acquired, right? What are you doing? You are saying that you are acquiring that architecture because the mind is ready in some sense. The mind is predisposed in some sense to learn that architecture or to acquire that architecture. Okay, right? If you are able to learn a system, right? Right? You learn that system because you already have some means in your mind, some equipment in your mind, in terms of which you learn that system. Okay, so now the system, and look at the relatedness between the system and cognizing that system, or acquiring that system. You acquire the system, right, because there is some system in your mind which really, in terms of which you acquire that system more easily than some other system, right? Okay, that is what, that makes you feel that, okay, maybe, there is a genetic endowment. We are born with a certain capacity, right? We are born with a certain kind of, gift, nature's gift, in terms of which we make sense out of our linguistic experience. What does that mean, to make sense of linguistic experience? We are able to construct a grammar from the data that we are exposed to, right, as children, right? We are able to do that because there is already something in our mind, right, in terms of which we do this. Okay, Okay. Otherwise we can't, right? you cannot make, you can make sense out of experience only in terms of an intellectual, only in terms of knowledge. Without knowledge, there is no way you can understand experience, right? This is a very, very important thing that, that we have to keep in mind. Okay, huh? Okay. So, so how do I get that? Where do I get it from? It cannot be taught. Okay, you can't teach a 1-year-old child, right, a grammar, right? What kind of instruction do they get? They get some simple instruction about, this is the object, this is called this is called that, this is the mother, this is father, etc., etc. Okay, very simple. But then no sophisticated information, and yet a whole grammar, a system is learned. So that it simply means that by, we are somehow by nature we are gifted with some kind of a knowledge, right? In terms of which we understand that we make sense of experience and acquire that knowledge. Okay, call that knowledge now. So I mean, only saying this is not sufficient. Okay, so what is that knowledge? How do I describe it? Now call that knowledge universal grammar. So what am I born with? I am born with universal grammar, right? Now another name for universal grammar is the initial state of knowledge of language. Okay, the initial state of knowledge of language, right? How do I describe initial state of knowledge of language? By working out the architecture of universal grammar. Now you see the connections now, right? Which grammar is the best out of a number of possible grammars? That grammar which explains language acquisition facts better, right? Now what does it? What does it really mean? That you see, in order to acquire language, in order to acquire a language or the structure of a language, we already have to, we have to have a structure in terms of which makes sense of other structures explicitly available to us. Okay, huh? So now look at the connection, and I think it's a supreme creative. It's a demonstration of the supremely creative mind of Chomsky, which connected these questions. Both of these are civilizational questions. How do we learn a language? Okay, look, no civilization asks this question. How do we learn geometry? Okay, but it is asked, obviously the reason is very, not a, we know why, because geometry is always learned at a later level, okay, but language is learned, by 1-year-olds, demonstrate their their command of language, okay. That doesn't happen in case of mathematics, right? So obviously, you don't ask a question like, how do you learn Arthashastra, right? Okay, you learn it, through explicit instruction. But in language case, it is different, right? So anyway, so this question as to how a language is learned has been asked, by people in various cultures thousands of years ago. How do I describe the structure of a language is also a question which had been asked even probably before, these acquisition questions were asked. Okay, huh? They were different questions. In Panini's Ashtadhyayi, you will have absolutely no account of how this is learned. In Kumarila Bhatta and other philosophers' speculations who raise this question of how a language is learned, you will find absolutely nothing about the phonological structure or the morphological structure of a language. Okay, they are different questions. Now, see, these different questions are sort of seen as one by Chomsky. Okay, huh? So universal grammar can also be described as the initial state of knowledge of language. Okay, huh? And we think that initial state of knowledge of language, is what we are born with. Okay, and I will conclude because there is a lot to say, but I will conclude by making only one point. See, why is this enterprise so exciting? This enterprise is so exciting, because hundreds and hundreds of unresolved questions. Okay, huh? So you all the time feel that what we know is probably not right. Okay, right? Maybe see, we have some confidence, okay, but we are never sure that we are even approaching, we are going the right way. We don't even know. One simple problem is this. See, that one can analyze the structure of a sentence without knowing the meaning of that sentence. Colorless green ideas slay furiously. You can assign a structure to this without bothering about its meaning. Okay, so NPVP, whatever, right? You can work out the internal structure. I have tested the following, but I mean, my testing may be wrong, but I have done the following. I have take it to the level of discourse. A discourse comprises several sentences, right? 10 sentences, let us say, So I gave a paragraph, I gave some three, page to my students, okay, and it was on the footballer Pele, okay, a beautiful write-up by Eduardo Galeano. So I just removed the paragraph divisions and all that and gave the text to my students. One would think that, if you are talking about the structure of a written text, one would think that chunks, you will divide them into chunks, and in some sense a chunk would correspond to a paragraph in print. Okay. Suppose you do that. So that is an assumption which I had. What is the structure of the discourse, right? So we can think, okay, we can divide them into chunks, which is what the computational linguists, some of them who are working on discourse, do. And then, so let's say we do this, okay. Now we give it to students, right? See, you would find, this is what I found, you would also find that people divide them into paragraphs depending on the meanings. Because if they do not know the meanings, they simply would not be able to arrive at any decision with respect to which become a chunk and which not. How does it, and how is it? If it is correct that the structure of a sentence can be analyzed or can be arrived at without reference to meaning at all, that's absolutely clearly demonstrated, right? Okay. And, whereas in course of discourse, which is actually sum total of sentences, this simply doesn't seem to work. Then what's happening? Can we have one theory for sentences, another theory for discourse, which itself is, comprises several sentences? No, I don't know what's happening, So, you see, there are hundred, and there are much more technical internal questions, right, which we have, and we do not know the answers to those questions, right? We are working on them, we don't know the answers. So, an enterprise is alive and kicking if there are unresolved problems, okay, right? So that is why, this program of doing generative linguistics is exciting. I will end by making this only one observation about the contribution of Chomsky. See, there are many people who have at many times said that Chomsky has misled linguistic community by, his theories, okay, right? But he has done something, and I would even say that maybe all that we know today, principles and parameters theory, whatever, all that we know today may turn out to be absolutely blatantly wrong. Possible. Maybe more interesting, more formal grammars would arise, and they would emerge and say that all this is wrong. But there is one thing that cannot be proved to be wrong. Chomsky has set the agenda of how to do linguistics. Okay, right? These formal mechanisms may be substituted, but nobody can say that you will have one theory for Sanskrit, one theory for one grammatical theory for Sanskrit, and one grammatical theory for Hindi. You can't do that. You have to tackle the question of universals. You cannot go back to an earlier stage and say each language has its own structure. No, that is gone. So you have to tackle the question of universals. You cannot anymore say that when we talk about the structure of languages, we will not raise these fundamental questions regarding acquisition. No. So whatever theories you come up with, okay, whatever new balances you come up with, where what is biologically given and what is learned from experience, it is the same thing, nature and nurture, what is given, what is learned through experience. So there may be many ways of fine tuning between the relations between these, but the fact remains that there cannot be a day, there will not be a day when you would say that, okay, we need separate grammatical theories for different grammatical theories for different languages. We will not ask acquisition questions when we raise questions of structure. These are not the things that we cannot go back to those days of innocence. And that is here is a man who has told us how to do linguistics. So the technical solutions may all turn out to be wrong, but there is no going back to universal grammar. Okay, there may be different articulation of the grammar. The architecture that we may come up with may not be the same, but there is no question of saying that no, it's wrong. That we don't want to do it anymore. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.